And the next keynote is Know Your Enemy, Understand, Prepare, and Proactively Protect Against the Latest Cyber Threats. So we will be joined by two hosts for this session, both from FireEye Mandiant Consulting Group. The first person who will be joining us will be Jon Øvergaard Christensen, and he's the Nordic Manager and Principal Consultant for Mandiant Consulting and Red Teamer Services. And also joining him for the keynote will be Jens Christian Høe Monrad, who's the EMEA Head of Mandiant Threat Intelligence. And really excited to have these gentlemen with us today as they're going to discuss the cyber threat landscape and the threat actor spotlight on Fin 11, and also how to operationalize cyber threat intelligence. So we have one of the gentlemen with us. Good morning, sir. Yeah, I can't quite hear you yet. Are you on mute?
Good morning. Sorry about that.
Great. Thank you for joining us. Really great to have you, and your colleague will be with us in a second. I've just introduced you, and I've talked about your background and what you're going to talk about. So if you're ready to kick off with the presentation, we'd love you to jump right in and talk to us about knowing your enemy.
Sure thing. I think Jens, my colleague, has just joined as well, and he'll be starting the presentation.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Great. Jens, welcome. Great.
Thank you very much.
Great to have you here. I've already introduced you. It is time to rock and roll. Really looking forward to hearing your presentation. Take it away, gentlemen. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to verify, you can see the presentation.
Absolutely, yeah. Know your enemy.
Perfect. Excellent. Thank you. Yeah, and thank you very much for the opportunity. I know we are running a tight schedule, so I'll get things going. My name is Jens, and together with Jon, I'll be talking a bit about the threat landscape in the finance sector, but I'm also going to maybe share a few ideas, and I know Jon is going to do the same thing on how to maybe improve the security. But in order to kick this off, I think there's a few things I would like for the participants to take away from today's session. The first one being, how are you doing against your adversaries? And I think what is important here is to understand that when we look into today's cyber threat landscape, it is really about understanding who are targeting you rather than trying to address every single cyber threat that is out there. Simply because we lack resources in organization, we don't have enough time, and we don't necessarily have enough context to block everything. So it's really about understanding who are targeting you based on the industry or based on your location, for example. The other thing that is very, I think, key to understand is that when we talk about cyber threat actors today, it's really about motivation. And the thing is that I think it's very important to understand that cyber attacks are rarely personal. They happen due to the industry or due to geopolitical situations. So you need to change the mindset and start to look into what is the motivational factors behind the cyber attack. As an example, cyber attackers, they don't necessarily see the difference between a low-level employee and the CFO or the CEO. And they don't necessarily care about if it's a personal or if it's a business email. For them, it's much more an opportunity of getting into a target's network. And that can equally happen on a personal email, or it could happen on a company email, for example. And the other thing that I think is important to clear up, that in very rare occasions, also when we investigate incidents, it's not because they are looking for something very specific and then they will just take that item or those specific assets. They will look inside the network and they will take whatever they can get, because it's really not up to us as victims to understand how cyber criminals or even nation state-sponsored espionage campaigns, how they can monetize or utilize the data that they're stealing. That is really up to the attacker to decide. So I think that's also something that is very important to understand. When we look into the financial services sector specifically, I've tried to simplify it a bit in order to visualize the current threat landscape. One of the things that we assess, for example, is that cybercrime is a very high risk in the finance service sector, but it's closely followed by cyber espionage. So when we look into the frequency and the magnitude of cyber attacks today, those are the two motivational factors that we see are targeting the industry. But they target the industry for different reasons. Obviously, cyber criminals, they are much more focused on how to monetize the data that they're stealing. One of the latest trends that we're going to talk more in depth about today is really how ransomware has changed the game in terms of focusing on that. Whereas, for example, cyber espionage can be for a variety of reasons, but in rare cases, it is about monetizing or trying to gain access to large sums of money. But most of the cases, we see that the sector is targeted because the nation's state goal is something that could be fulfilled, for example, by an espionage campaign in cyberspace. I think one of the most interesting things that I want to emphasize on this session today is when we look into the cyber criminal ecosystem, it is really much a very agile system, and it's probably much more agile than most businesses can operate today. One of the things that we, for example, have seen is that cyber threat actors have shifted their focus from focusing on how to monetize stolen credit card data to now actually run targeted ransomware campaigns against organizations, including organizations in this industry as well. And this is happening for a variety of reasons. But the first reason is obviously that the maturity within the credit card issuers and other industries that are utilizing credit cards, they have matured a lot. So the value of stolen credit card data is really diminishing. But there's still an appetite for making money as a cyber criminal, and therefore we are seeing this shift. And I know Jon is going to talk more about Fin11, so I'll pause there. The other thing that I want to maybe wrap up my short presentation with is really, I also want the audience here to reflect on what is the optimal way to deny or detect the adversaries that you now understand are tracking you. I ran a quick statistics, and one of the interesting things here was that the most exploited vulnerability in the finance service industry that we track globally today, that is actually a vulnerability that happened in or was identified in 2017. So when we talk about the optimal way of denying or detecting the adversaries, clearly if more than 50% of the vulnerabilities that we see cyber criminals are successful utilizing today is more than 3 years old, close to 4 years old, then obviously there's something to learn about how to maybe incorporate better strategies about patching, identifying vulnerable systems, and so on. The other thing, as far as numbers that I want to highlight, is that we just a few days ago released what we call the M-Trends report, which is our annual report based on incident response, where we provide metrics and some of the learnings from the previous year. And when I look into the European region, the median dwell time number is 66 days. So that means from you discover an actual breach until you can actually start recovering from it, that takes 66 days on a median dwell time. And clearly, if you need to improve that number, that's something that is where you need to rethink processes. And it's a much smaller number for ransomware for a variety of reasons that I know Jon will talk about. So while I'm wrapping up my short presentation here, is really how do we move things forward? And I think one thing that I talk a lot about with executives and when I do keynotes is that you need to start factoring the external threat landscape with your most critical assets. And I think that's something that many organizations still, they still need to do that. Some organizations are starting on that journey, but it's really important to understand what are some of the outside threats and how how can they be aligned with my internal risk? How do geography and sector and industry in the cyber threat landscape play along with the different people that I have, my infrastructure, my data, and so on. So I think what I always recommend organizations to do or consider is to start building a cyber threat profile that really take into account the changes in the cyber threat landscape. As a good example, going from stolen credit card data to now doing targeted ransomware operations, and factor in what are your most critical assets, what sort of information and risk do your stakeholders inside your organization consider the most business critical for operation, for example. Those things are really important today in order to address the current and future cyber threats. So with that, I think I'll hand over to Jon, and Jon, you can just let me know if I need to change slide, or you can take controls.
Yeah, will do. Thanks, Jens. Yes, so one of the most important aspects in understanding how to defend is, of course, also understanding who is your enemy, who is it that's trying to exploit their way into your systems and actually try to cause an impact to your systems. And one of the threat actors that we saw evolving over 2020, it's also detailed in the M-Trends report, is the Fin11 actor. So we've actually been tracking them for a long time, and we've kind of been building up our understanding and sort of recently promoting them into a fully fledged Fin threat actor. And that goal is obviously to make money. And that's when we've seen them move into this double extortion ransomware setup, where they will try to utilize various techniques, as you see a little bit of it mapped here on the right with the MITRE map, to actually get into the system and then very quickly escalate through the network up to a point where they can deploy ransomware along a large amount of systems, but then also at the same time discover any kind of business critical information that they can use and exfiltrate, that they can use as leverage. Because what we're seeing is that not just the point of defending the system from actually being ransomware, but also defending it against an extortion where they do get access to that information that might result in a massive GDPR fine or something that will be sensitive to release, like the prime source code or the IP or whatever. So they do go after these dual set of targets. And on my part, and within the sort of the red team, when we actually have to help clients understand this, we have to also simulate this behavior, which involves us actually doing both of those elements from a completely unknown background against the different companies. Next slide, please. So what that kind of requires when you have to simulate something like that is that we work with the clients to actually build tests where we base it around this threat intel that Jens also talked about. Because if you want to be able to defend against something like this, you have to actually understand what it is they do and how they do it. And that's, as Jens says, that comes down to like understanding on an initial level, like what kind of exploits and stuff are they running? What kind of tools are they running? But also, where are they starting? What is the access points? Where do they begin their campaigns against your company? Is it via phishing email, which is what we see a lot? Or have they actually found an easier way to get in? Because as Jens mentioned, they don't see your company as some kind of monolith that just sits there and is very well defended. They see you using a third-party provider for your marketing platform, and then they realize that if they want to get in there, they will. They're very opportunistic, and they don't necessarily have a prescribed approach. So taking that step back and trying to see where are my weak points, and not just my weak points, but the weak points of anyone that I work with. And that's absolutely key to understanding how to go about defending, setting that realistic start point and setting that realistic end game where you know what they actually want. And that is gaining access probably to the backups to remove those, finding stuff to extort you with, which requires exfiltration, and then usually gaining some kind of access to an enterprise admin or similar on the domains so they can actually launch the ransomware. But you have to take that step back and you have to make sure that you use the right tools and everything. So the whole engagement flow also becomes quite convoluted because you can't just rely on the fact that you think you know how the ransomware is going to think. You're like, all right, they'll probably do phishing and they'll probably land on this system. And then they might go and try to run some exploits. That's not at all what we're seeing. We're seeing the ransomware groups take a step back and actually analyze the systems they've landed on. They do a lot of internal recon. And while they move very fast, and this is what Jens alluded to as well, that while the dwell time might be 66 days in the European sector, when it comes to the ransomware groups, it's much lower. It's usually less than a week, which means that you have that week to discover them within your network, react to them and kick them out to the point where they're not going to just come straight back in because they dropped a couple of persistence backdoors. So what we kind of advertise and what we kind of want everyone to do is kind of go through and actually do these continuous red teamings and continuous engagements where you map out all the different paths and you actually map those against the MITRE ATT&CK framework so you can determine if you're getting better over time. Do you start the different elements at the right point? Do you even understand what it is that they do? If you look at all these elements marked in red, which is from engagements that we have done as a simulation, you can see that most of these things would not have been detected with like an automated scanning. Like running internal scanning, finding vulnerabilities, did not stop any of these. It comes down to actually understanding network weaknesses on a much deeper level. And that is the same level that the ransomware actors would do. You can see the consequences sort of here in yellow. And this is what you're going to be dealing with if you kind of don't take that step to really understand the threat actor. And understanding the threat actor does require you to simulate the threat actor, but also dive deep into the threat intel that do exist out there. You have to really figure out not only who are your enemies, but then once you have, then actually deep dive into what you can do about it. Next slide, please. And that's what we kind of seen and trying to help clients with their evolving security programs where everything is kind of evolving. The complexity is evolving. It used to be penetration tests against different applications. It used to be penetration tests against external systems, network scanning, you know, trying to figure out whether or not you can stop something if you have no patches outstanding. And nowadays we're seeing clients step away and go like, well, there might be some patches outstanding, but that's not really going to be what's going to stop the ransomware actor. What's going to stop them is actually understanding exactly how they think and how they're going to move through the networks. So we've seen the move from penetration testing to this threat intel-led adversarial simulation. We also see the approach changing. So red teaming, which I've done a lot of, is something that, again, we're seeing clients kind of move a little bit away from necessarily, or evolving at least into more of a purple team model, where the red team on our side will work with the client to actually do all the testing so they can understand and ask questions throughout. Realism is also increasing. Used to be using commercial red team tools was enough. Now you need to use the actual APT malware to really see if you can detect it. Frequency, moving from annual testing into continuous testing. That means testing every quarter, trying to get up to date with what's happening and seeing the improvements quarter to quarter. Interconnectivity used to be the red team versus the client's blue team. Now it's the red and the blue team working together, trying to make sure that they can get a better understanding. And the integratedness, like external providers, and now we're seeing clients wanting to integrate and build those internal red teams for themselves and using the external partners as sort of like leveraging their knowledge to build up this internal knowledge base. So across the board, the security programs are evolving to actually kind of deal with these more complicated threats. Next slide, please. And that's where we also just wanted to kind of point out some of the common issues that we see and some of the common considerations, right? We see a large, if you really want to just get some quick wins on how to defend against Fin11 and actually try and stop them, then take away the 5 things on the left, like go and see if you can figure out why there's so many SPN accounts. Why is there so many highly privileged accounts in your Active Directory? Have you detected any group policy changes? Can you even detect them when the ransomware actually gets deployed? And how do you actually know if your security controls are working across the endpoints? Have you tried to stop lateral movement via firewall and policies? Like if you can stop lateral movement and you can stop that initial endpoint from landing, you've got a good chance of actually detecting them in progress. And if you can spot the GPO changes, well, then you might get the master ransomware is being deployed. But some of the considerations to take away from this is also make sure you have the backups, make sure you've actually tested your recovery and make sure that the recovery isn't standing right next to the primary systems, because if it isn't in a secure enclave somewhere and protected, then it's not really a backup, it's just a system next to the original system. And then also make sure that you can verify the third-party vendor solutions and functions actually work against real attacks. We see a lot of clients invest a huge sum of money on a product that's only ever been demoed, it's not been tested for real, and then their answers are, you don't know if it works. And similarly, all inbound connections could be compromised, and that includes the supply chain. Something to keep in mind is that the supply chain is always wider than you think. Do you use like even open source tooling as well? Well, technically that's also part of the supply chain. But yeah, Jens, do you have any closing comments? Otherwise, that was everything from me.
Yeah, I think the only quick comment I would like to make, and the reason why we're showing Fin11 is also that this Fin11 is a group that illustrates the point of changing behavior. They used to focus on monetizing stolen credit card data, where to the point where they figure out this is not a viable option anymore. The return on investment, to put it bluntly, wasn't good enough for them. So they actually changed their behavior to now focus on targeting organizations and doing post-compromise ransomware deployments, where they're now earning millions from their victims, right? So I think that's understanding that agility in the cyber threat landscape is really key when we move forward in 2021 and into the future as well.
Thank you so much for your comments and for your presentation today. Very, very interesting discussions about how deeply you need to go into your systems to protect them and how much knowledge you have to have. So to both John and Jens, thank you so much for your input into our event today. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us on.
Thank you.